planned a video about the different kernels that you can use for Arch Linux. I'm going to be focusing on the main kernels, so those being the Linux kernel, Linux Zen, Linux LTS, and there's one more, isn't there? Is there one more? Wait, is there only 3? Wait. Arch Linux kernels. I felt like there was 4. Am I just imagining a 4th kernel, or am I forgetting one? Hardened. Of course, hardened, yeah. So there's stable, which is the main one. That is the Linux package. Then you have Linux hardened, Linux LTS, and Linux Zen. And after doing that video, I wanted to go and try out the Zen kernel and sort of see what it was going to be like. At this stage, I don't really have anything, like, to say about it. Like, this is the weird thing. So, a lot of... oh, God. We good? Okay, yeah, we're good. A lot of the benefits that supposedly come from using the Zen kernel are sort of... I guess they're hard to measure effects. They're things like your windows feel snappier to move around and other little things like that. But there are actually some measurable benefits, and those are what I'm going to be focusing the video on. Obviously, I'll bring those things up to spoil the video. I don't really notice a difference when it comes to, like, the general computing experience. It feels basically as it did before. Like, there's nothing really different in that respect. But where it does potentially differ, I haven't actually run the numbers yet, but it does feel better, is in things like game load times and also game frame rates, because the Zen kernel has a feature built into it called F-Sync. Now, I don't fully understand F-Sync, but it's supposed to be something about better utilizing more cores or something like that. I don't exactly know the whole detail with it, but I will be running numbers on that. We're running a couple of benchmarks just to see whether there's actually a reasonable difference between them. And I'll obviously look into, like, how F-Sync actually works, like what it's actually doing before I do that video. This is more like me just in the early planning stages of actually going through that. Because unlike a lot of my other videos where I can sort of just, like, you know, dick them out, blow them out, smash them out. Smash them out, that's the one I'm thinking of. Smash, blow them out. Smash them out in a couple of hours. With this one, I actually want to put some, you know, on-the-ground experience, actually trying it out for a while and seeing what it's actually like. Because while I can just, you know, I can talk about it with that couple of hours of experience, I don't think I can really say whether it's a justified move over without properly looking into it like that. But from my brief experience, frame rates I don't notice, because every game that I play, I run with a locked frame rate and I lock it to 60. So if it's at 60 anyway, like, I'm not noticing a difference there. I will unlock it when I do the test just to see what's actually going to happen. But with Final Fantasy XIV, I noticed the loading into the game feels a bit quicker. I don't know if it's actually quicker, but it does seem like it is quicker. So if it is, that's good. If it's not, and I'm just imagining it, well, that's what the numbers are actually going to tell us. I don't know what games I'm actually going to use to benchmark it. Obviously, I'm going to be using Final Fantasy because I play a lot of Final Fantasy. But I'll probably also look into games that are known to work really well and known to work really poorly with F-Sync, just to see if there is, you know, some difference there, or if just generally the Zen kernel is a better experience, or it might be a worse experience. I don't know. Because when you look up stuff about the Zen kernel, the vast majority of what you see is people saying, the Zen kernel makes my computer feel faster. But there's very, very few videos on the actual numbers. Like, here is objectively how much better the experience is. And I sort of want to fill that gap. People have been asking me to talk about kernels for a long time, and, you know, I might as well do that. Now, there are some other things with the Zen kernel which are obviously very measurable. Things like how the Zen kernel has a bunch of extra modules that you would want to use for general user computing that are not enabled by default with a different kernel like the Linux kernel. For example, like the module needed to run Anbox. I can't remember what the module's actually called. Install Anbox. Let's see what it says. Please read install kernel modules. Yes, that one. Anbox modules DKMS. Okay, it's just the Anbox Oh, here we go. Ashmem and Binder. Those are two modules you need to run with Anbox, which aren't enabled by default or don't even come with the stable version of the Linux kernel. And I want to try out Anbox at some point, so that's something I will be talking about basically as well. That's something that is, you know, objectively there. Like, it is either not there or it is there. That's very easy to quantify. The general user experience is going to be considerably more difficult, but I think it's valuable content, even though I don't expect the video to do super well. So I'll be framing it from an Arch Linux perspective, but like the Zen kernel, the Hardened kernel, the LTS kernel aren't just a Arch Linux thing. The versions being used by Arch are patched in certain ways to make them better in the Arch experience. Things that the Arch maintainers want to add. But the Zen kernel, I think, yeah, it was originally made for Debian. LTS, the most known LTS that you would use is something like Ubuntu LTS. Now, running the LTS kernel on Arch doesn't turn Arch into a, you know, LTS, into a stable, into an LTS distro, anything like that. It just means the kernel won't be updated until the next version of LTS comes out, which you can find out over on kernel.org. So the current latest LTS is 4.19.214. That came out, I guess. Actually, wow, they just updated it. That came out yesterday, apparently. And then there's Linux Next. Linux Next isn't actually part of the 4 main kernels you can get on Arch, but you can go and obviously install it. You can install like any kernel you want. For example, you could get the Git kernel, which is basically just going to the Linux Git repo and literally just compiling it. You know, I wouldn't recommend doing that because there's a reason why they don't release the kernel like that. It's because getting the latest Git commit is always going to be, in many ways, unstable because it hasn't been fully tested, or there's going to be extra things that need to be added to actually make it stable, things like that. So if you wanted to go with any of the more bleeding edge kernels, it probably makes more sense to go with the Next kernel. The Next kernel is basically a step ahead of the latest stable kernel. Think of it like a beta test for the stable kernel, and all or most of those features that are in the Next kernel will be merged into stable when stable moves up to that, and then Next will be further ahead. This is basically if you need the absolute bleeding edge. So like, I don't know, there's some like weird technology that's just being supported in the kernel, and I honestly don't have a great example for it. It's like maybe some like new CPU architecture for example. Not like a mainline CPU architecture like an Intel or an AMD. Some extra architecture that may take time to be supported. Things like that are the reason why you might want to run Next. For general consumers, running Next really is not the best. Or maybe it's something like you're doing some research work and the drivers for whatever thing you need to be working with are going to be merged in the Next kernel. Things like that. That's sort of why you might want to use that kernel. But there's plenty of other kernels you can go with, and that's before you even go to doing things like compiling your own kernel, which I wouldn't recommend doing. The problem with compiling your own kernel is when you compile your own kernel, you need to then compile your own kernel every time a new kernel version comes out, or whenever you want to migrate to the next version, which is annoying.